Good day, and thank you so much for joining Black Agenda Report. This week, Black Agenda Report is giving special attention to the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th, 1776. We acknowledge this date while, of course, living up to our mission of providing news, commentary, and analysis from the Black left. So, who better to join us in this effort than Dr. Gerald Horne, professor at the University of Houston and a prolific author whose 2014 book, The Counter Revolution of 1776 Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, will be the focus of our discussion. Thank you so much for coming back, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
You know, counter revolution is a term that's generally not associated with what's called the American Revolution. Um, so tell us why the events of 1776 were a counter revolution.
Well, you have to understand, first of all, the indigenous question. That is to say, there were minimally 500 indigenous nations on the cusp of the revolt against British rule in the 1770s. But as a result of the success of that revolt, most of those indigenous nations were liquidated, not to mention the nationals who were part of those nations, up to and including when the United States of America leaped across the Pacific into Hawaii and helped to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy, which was a reformist monarchy. You had telephones and electricity in the archipelago, oftentimes before you had it on the mainland. So it's difficult to suggest, as many of our friends on the left have done, that 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity when it led to such disastrous, catastrophic results for the indigenous population, results that continue to resound. And then there's the question of enslavement of Africans. On the cusp of the revolt against British rule in 1776, there were thousands of enslaved Africans. On the verge of the US Civil War in 1861, there were millions. Now, some of our friends try to convince us that 1776 was ultimately an abolitionist enterprise. But if that is the case, I would hate to see a pro slavery enterprise, given the exponential increase in the number of enslaved Africans. I think part of the problem is, and I would say this also for members of the Guild, that is to say, historians who write about 1776, not to mention our friends to the left who don't necessarily do any original research and then draw upon the writings of historians in order to come to their conclusions. Oftentimes, they begin the story in the middle of the 18th century, and that's akin to coming into a complicated movie in the middle of the show and thinking that you've understood everything that transpired before the movie began, not to mention the fact that you'll probably be misled about the conclusion. And that's one of the reasons why my book, The Counter Revolution of 1776, is really part of a trilogy, a trilogy that includes the dawning of the apocalypse, which deals with the origins of white supremacy and settler colonialism and enslavement in the 1500s, and then the apocalypse of settler colonialism, which deals with the 1600s, and then the counter-revolution of 1776 obviously deals with the 1700s, because this is a very complicated story. But to reduce it to its most simple elements, it's fair to suggest, and this is part of the unfortunate aspect of analyses of the creation of the United States of America, it's fair to suggest that many Europeans and many who were European adjacent, speaking of Lebanese Christians like Ralph Nader, for example, they benefited from the creation of the United States of America. But I'm not sure if the rest of us, not to mention those who benefited and their descendants, should be celebrating what I've called the creation of the first apartheid state. because when you invoke the term of apartheid, it forces us to analyze what happened in South Africa in 1948, wherein the ruling class decided that in order to preserve their misrule, they had to uplift the living standards and the life outcomes of a good deal of the European poor. And apartheid, to that degree, was successful. But I'm not sure if that worked as a precedent for the African majority. Otherwise, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress should not have launched armed struggle. They should have just waited for history to work its magic. And so, likewise, to suggest that 1776 created a precedent for the rest of us is really foolish, uh, given the blood, sweat, and tears our ancestors had to expend in order to beat back slavery and then, to a degree, beat back Jim Crow. And so, in other words, I think that the liberal analysis of 1776, which will be on full display on July 4th, 2026, is demobilizing because it leads to inadequate and incorrect analyses of the present, which obviously are misleading and misguiding given the rise of Trumpism, which raises another point, which is that one of the reasons we study history and so that we can have some insight into the present. And many of our friends on the left, their analysis of the alleged profound progressive aspects of 1776, it's not connected to the present. That is to say, what went wrong in terms of this so-called grand revolution of the 18th century to the brink of neo-fascism in 2026? Where did this project go off the rails? They have little or nothing to say because they throw up a great wall between the past and the present, which makes history basically irrelevant and to a degree makes them irrelevant as well.
The title of your book is about slave resistance. And from the time I was a child, the only Black person I was told about was Crispus Attucks, a Black man who was killed by the British at what was later called the Boston Massacre. And that was the way that we were taught that Black people were connected with the revolution as siding with the enslavers. Now, what was far more common was Black people being allied with and fighting for the British. And this is something that is not spoken of very often, but that was the slave resistance of this quote unquote revolutionary war, wasn't it?
Indeed. And let's go to the numbers. We know, and we have known for some time, that the number of Africans who fought with the Redcoats dwarfed the number of Africans who fought with George Washington's forces, not least because this so called preeminent founding father initially was reluctant to accept Black people into his ranks, which was understandable because uh, there was a morbid fear of seeing Black men with rifles in their hands. And that also is the precursor to a certain extent for why the settlers chose to revolt. That is to say, that London was becoming heavily reliant upon Black men with guns to be in what was eventually called the West Indian regiments. London had a sprawling empire, not just in North America, but in the Caribbean, increasingly in India, ultimately in Africa. And it's a relatively small country. We're talking about a contemporary population of 60 million compared to India's contemporary population of 1.4 billion. And in the prelude to 1776, and you had the spectacle, at least spectacle as far as the colonizers were concerned, of seeing Black men in Boston manhandling and roughhousing certain settlers. Even today, that would be seen as a mortal sin. And then I must say, to go back to the Guild, there's been a curious dearth of curiosity on the part of many historians in this country. They focus on the 13 colonies, although we know that there were more than 13 colonies in the Americas with regard to London. And for example, look at Florida, for example. Florida, as of 1776, was under London's control as a result of a number of maneuvers involving ousting the traditional colonizer and settler, speaking of the Spanish. Well, uh, first of all, Florida did not revolt against British rule. In fact, after many found out about the Declaration of Independence of July 4th, they hung John Hancock and Samuel Adams in effigy in St. Augustine, Florida, the major urban node of what is now the Sunshine State. And interestingly enough, Spain assisted the settlers against London, just like France assisted the settlers against London. Indeed, it's possible to suggest that George Washington and company would not have prevailed but for this kind of assistance, which makes even more ironic, if not tragic, the fact that if you fast forward and look at the results of the United States of America, they're always making a big stink about other countries having foreign assistance. Recall what happened in Angola in 1975 after independence when they called upon Cuban troops. That was seen as just horrendous, for example. And interestingly enough, after Spain helped the settlers prevail, Spain then reversed a policy that had existed since they had invaded what they call St. Augustine in 1565. That is to say, freeing the Africans who were able to make their way from the colonies to the north, such as Virginia and the Carolinas, etc., to St. Augustine. That's what made Florida under Spanish rule so important. But then after the settlers prevail and establish the United States of America, the settlers then not only oust their erstwhile comrades, speaking of the Spanish, from ruling Florida, which is part of the double dealing that we come to accept as normative with regard to this so-called republic, but in a remarkable maneuver, as of 1790, when the republic was in its infancy, Spain was forced to reverse its policy because it had returned to ruling Florida as part of the booty after they had assisted the defeat of Britain. Spain reversed its policy and refused to provide sanctuary to Africans fleeing from Georgia, fleeing from the Carolinas, etc. This was a stunning and staggering defeat for the Black population, and it helps to illustrate one of my central theses, which is that whatever it might have been, the creation of the United States of America was not a great leap forward for Black people. It was a great leap backwards for Black people. And our friends on the left need to realize that basically what they're endorsing at best is a kind of left wing white nationalism, which bleeds easily into the kind of right wing populism, which is fair to say is a reigning ideology amongst settler descendants in the United States of America,
And
mostly across class lines.
those black people called loyalists. I don't know if that's a proper term, being loyal to the crown because they were promised freedom if by the British, but the British didn't win. What happened to those people who joined the British in combat against the U.S. colonizers?
Well, part of this is covered in a docudrama that I would recommend entitled The Book of Negroes, produced by Canadian Broadcasting, South African Broadcasting, and BET. And it tells the tale of Africans who flee after the establishment of the Republic. They flee to Nova Scotia, Canada, where their descendants continue to reside. Some of them flee to London, where their descendants continue to reside. Some of them flee to West Africa, Sierra Leone. Some of them flee to the Bahamas, for example, where their descendants continue to reside. Some of them flee to Jamaica. Uh, some of them with regard to Florida, for example, the so-called Negro loyalists, they flee behind Native American lines. And there hangs a tale because you have a de facto merger between and amongst Black people and certain indigenous groupings who, after the United States takes over Florida circa 1820, fight three of the bloodiest wars that the United States Army is involved in before the US Civil War in the early 1860s. And then, of course, you have certain scoundrels amongst the British who then sell loyalists back into Georgia, for example. But that is not necessarily the dominant trend. The dominant trend is also represented in round two of the battle against the United States of America. Speaking of the War of 1812, which witnessed the burning of Washington, D.C. in August 1814, oftentimes with Black men lighting the match, and the freeing of many Black people in Maryland, Virginia, and the district itself, some of whom flee to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside as well. I think what it is that perhaps understandably and justifiably in this perilous moment that we now confront and face, that many of our friends on the left, they would like to project unity both backwards and forward. That is to say, forward in terms of having this united front against fascism, and then backwards to try to find some sort of historical precedent. The problem with that kind of analysis is that it does violence to the historical record. And most Black people know instinctively that our ancestors did not receive a fair deal and a square deal from those with whom we shared this continent, speaking of the settlers. And therefore, they look askance, to put it mildly, at this attempt to manufacture and fabricate some sort of class collaboration between the enslaved and the enslavers. It just doesn't wash. I think we'd be much better off if we were to be honest in confronting the past. It reminds me, and I'm sure you recall, the wars in the Balkans a few decades ago, when the U.S. rulers were always telling the people in the former Yugoslavia, you have to confront your history, no matter how painful it might be. And I remember when I used to hear that, say, these people in this country, they don't confront their history. So what kind of nerve is it telling these people in Southeast Europe they should confront their histories? But that is the point. You have to confront your history, no matter how painful it might be, because it's like if you go to a physician and the physician tries to take a medical history, but you don't like your medical history, so you begin manufacturing facts. That'll be misleading to the doctor, who will then likely come up with an inadequate diagnosis and therefore a more than inadequate prescription. And so that's what myself, and I'm happy to say a growing list of others, are seeking to avoid. Speaking of which, if you look at the current issue of The Nation, the New York-based publication, or thenation.com, you'll see a review essay that I've written precisely on the matters we're now discussing, and I
And
direct your audience to it.
lastly, let's talk about these uh, dates and holidays for Black people. There's a lot of contradiction there with the 4th of July. I think most people are, they may not know the history in depth that you've been discussing, but they know our ancestors were enslaved. They know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slaveholders, and I believe most of those who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. I don't know if it's most, but it's a large portion. So I think people know this, but it's still this holiday, a day off, a day of people travel, family, friends, cookouts, etc. In general, what are your thoughts about these problematic dates and Black people?
Well, we should call it the farce of July as opposed to the 4th of July, because it's really, it's like asking turkeys to celebrate Thanksgiving, for example. Turkey should not be celebrating Thanksgiving, and you can make a credible argument that the revolt against British rule, as I foreshadowed a few moments ago, was instigated and fomented in no small measure because there was a fear that abolitionism was spreading in London, and this provided a danger to the major investment of the enslaving class. Indeed, on the verge of the US Civil War in 1861, the investment in the bodies of the millions of enslaved Africans was the most profitable and lucrative and sizable investment in the entire republic. And so, once again, I understand where there is an impetus on the part of some to try to forge a kind of unity. That is to say, unity today and then trying to find a historical precedent for it going back. But I think that that's basically a fool's errand in terms of going backward and trying to find a unity between enslavers and enslaved. And I understand it as well because we recognize that with regard to the European invaders, there was class collaboration. That is to say, that many poor Europeans did benefit from 1776, as I suggested a few moments ago. I've told the story more than once about the Cherokees, who were dominant in what is now the southeast quadrant of the United States of America, and sought to assimilate by converting to Christianity, enslaving Africans, etc. And many of them became quite wealthy. But when Andrew Jackson, Mr. Trump's favorite president, embarks on the so-called Indian removal of the late 1820s, early 1830s, these lucrative, these rather affluent Cherokees, they had to go too. And you had Europeans fresh off the boat who could move into their mansions, for example. So therein lies the so-called American dream. And so I understand why many defined as white celebrate July 4th, just as many of us whose ancestors died fighting against the creation of this so-called republic now term and denote it accurately as the farce of July, which brings me to another point, which is that uh, the creation of the United States is seen as a great leap forward for humanity, even if you set aside genocide and mass enslavement, because supposedly it led to an expansion of civil liberties. But if you look at the First Amendment and religious liberty, you should look at that in a materialist fashion, not to see it as something coming magically from the brains of intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson. That is to say, that it helped to expand the ranks of those who were going to fight the indigenous and keep the Africans in line. In fact, in my book on Southern California, my most recent book on Southern California, I pointed out that one of the chief so-called Indian fighters in San Diego County was a Jewish American man. And therein you begin to see the quote value unquote of religious liberty. That there's a material basis for it because you need numbers in order to subdue the indigenous and fight the Africans. And likewise, with regard to the Second Amendment, uh, the right to bear arms, I guarantee you, did not apply to the indigenous. In fact, it was sort of an anti-Second Amendment by any means necessary to keep guns and weapons out of the hands of the indigenous, out of the hands of the Africans. And to a certain extent, that still holds true. And so, once again, I think that those who consider themselves materialists, in the first instance, should do a materialist analysis of the creation of this republic. And it might help them to understand why we're on the verge of neo fascism. It might help us to understand why this so called revolutionary republic turned against what you would think it was this comrade in arms, speaking of the Haitian Republicans of the early 1800s, for example, still hostile, speaking of the Trump regime, to Haiti to this very day, or why the United States of America has been hostile to the Cuban Revolution, for example, hostile to virtually every revolution that has ensued since the 1790s, for example. There is so much to carp about with regard to 1776 that I could probably spend the rest of the many hours we have in store to look forward to with regard to Black and Gender Radio to to
Oh,
going on in this vein.
I thank you, and I recommend to our viewers and listeners, if you have not read this book, you must. You've written so many books, but we'll just for this week recommend the Counter Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. I think it is a work that belongs in every library. Thank you so much for joining me again, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.